you mic'd, or are you just going to speak? No, I'm just going to speak. Okay. Yeah, this sounds good.
Oh, yeah. Yep, we got the slides right here. Yeah. Slide advancers
Okay.
and the first three in the last slide.
Okay.
Can they hear? Can they hear us in there?
Okay, I'd say let's start.
All right. Welcome. The forum is starting now if you're in the other room. Please take your seats. My name is Kelly Shea. I use she, her pronouns. I am white with brown hair, purple top, black pants. Today's forum is about behavioral covenant, why we need one, and how we as a congregation can create one. How do we discover our covenant? How do we grow as community by living in covenant? When the new UU board met in retreat over last summer, the board decided it was important to work on a behavioral covenant for the church this year, as we didn't have one. Reverend Tina, Bill Prodorsky, and I volunteered and started to meet to understand behavioral covenants by going through the UU Institute's curriculum called Covenant Exploration 109. We gleaned information from the curriculum to get started, combined it with Reverend Tina's sermon on September 2024 called Invitation to Covenant, and added examples from other UU congregations. We came up with a plan. I am a newcomer to this process, so I captured some basics. We UUs are not bound by a single creed or set of beliefs. We are bound together by living in covenant with one another. Here we outline what a behavioral covenant is and how we can move forward in creating our own behavioral covenant. There we go. What is a covenant? Covenant is something a group creates together as a living agreement that is added to and changed as the group spends time together and makes additions or adaptations to their original set of promises. Covenant is more than just rules and guidelines. A covenant is something the congregation creates together, as I mentioned, and comes back to practice compassion, accountability, apology, forgiveness, and repair as we live in beloved community. Grace Lee Boggs, a key figure in the Asian American Black Power and Civil Rights Movement, wrote the following, which is paraphrased here. For covenants to be meaningful and powerful, they must be practiced and lived in the day-to-day interactions, so we will be prepared for more difficult situations between humans and inevitable conflicts. One of our practices needs to be noticing those small amounts of deciding whether or not to keep promises, small ones and large ones. Church is where we go to grow our hearts. Covenanting is how we practice growing our hearts. In other areas of our life, we are growing our minds, improving our health. We practice the piano, do our math homework, work out with weight reps and sit-ups. For covenant to be meaningful and powerful, it must be practiced.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, so we're going to be creating a covenant together here in March and then beyond into that month, and then voting on it at our annual meeting on May the 4th. And we're going to be talking about liberating covenants and creating a liberating covenant. So what is a liberating covenant, right? And creating a covenant to move us towards liberating beloved community and braver space. And here's the definition of beloved community from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King here that y'all can see. It is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit. Conflicts can be resolved peacefully, and adversaries can be reconciled through a mutual, determined commitment to nonviolence. No conflict need erupt in violence. All conflicts in the beloved community should end with reconciliation of adversaries cooperating together in a spirit of friendship and goodwill. And that is the definition of beloved community from the King Center, from MLK's words, and that is what the covenant strives towards, is building that beloved community. So the goal to allow us to engage in conflict creatively and lovingly, space for both and thinking, mistakes and forgiveness, and it connects us to something larger and to past and future generations. So this is just a little bit of the history of covenant, right, in religious communities. And Unitarian Universalism, like Kelly said, is a covenantal faith, not a creedal faith. We don't have a creed to be members of our congregation. So it's a set of promises we make to each other. It's relational work that we do here in our community. Some of the background, of course, is from our Jewish and Christian heritage and the Abrahamic covenant that was set with God, right? That is a part of our history as well. And then also the history of covenant and accountability and social contracts. So we have moral obligations to one another. Examples, a Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, 10 Commandments was a social contract, is a social contract. Code of Hammurabi, the Babylonian contract. Marriage, right, we know is a social contract as well. So those are just some of covenants, social contracts that we know exist. So as you're growing up, as a kid, right, you play games with other kids and like tag, right? And so that there's a social contract in playing that game, that there's rules to be followed in that game. And if someone is outside of the rules, usually the group of kids like talks to that kid and brings them back into the game, right? And the rules that have been made up by that group. So that is another form of social contract that we see our kiddos using out and about. So it's an agreement. It's not legally binding. And it can be changed as the group lives together, right? It's a living document that needs revision as the world around us changes. And then, so you can see some of the UUA covenant history there as well. In 1961, we came together and created a covenant. The Unitarians and the Universalists, we came together. And then in 1984, changes were made because it was dated and there was gendered language that needed to be changed. And then in 1995, a sixth source, Earth-centered religions, was added. And now, in 2024, just recently, we have our new UUA covenant stating our shared values, which is a shift away from the 7 principles and 6 sources, but it's still used, that language is still used to define our UU shared values. And so this is our UUA covenant in our Constitution and our bylaws, Article 2, and this is kind of the start language of our UUA covenant as you use here in this country. So yes, as Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. And inseparable from one another, these shared values are interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, and equity. That's just some background as we think about our covenant here in our congregation. So the why. Why are we creating a congregational covenant? So covenants provide a sense of accountability and give us a framework for dealing with conflict when it arises. And it's also a practice of compassion, accountability, apology, and forgiveness and repair. Covenant reflects on how to create a safe and inclusive space for all, even when we make mistakes, because we're infallible. And it is important in our communities because it teaches us as people who come from all walks of life and different backgrounds how to deal with the humanness we all have inside of us. It helps us guide our day-to-day relationships, to help us come back to one another and the community when there has been harm to us or to another, and to prepare us for the larger work of transforming our hurting world. And just like Kelly said, we go to church because it is where we grow our hearts. And there's a story from the UU Institute and a retired religious educator, Annie, who used to serve up in Golden at Jefferson Unitarian Church up there in Colorado. And there was a kid who asked their parent, "Why do we go to church? Why do we have to go?" And the parent said, "It is where we go to grow our hearts." And then covenanting is how we practice that, right? So it's how we practice growing our hearts. We learn and practice the skills to live in covenant. And we have to be brave, vulnerable, and be changed. So a quote that I like is, "We've been given the covenant community because we need each other, and together we'll be more mature, experience more life, and know more joy than we ever would apart from one another." And to whom are we ethically bound in our community? Each other, right? We're ethically bound to each other. So again, this is relational work with ourselves and others in our community. And there's already enough division in this world, as we know, and covenant is about bringing us into relationship with one another and is about building bridges. So that's a little bit of the why. And then we have behavioral versus aspirational covenants. So our aspirational covenant, we say every Sunday, right? Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. We recite this. This is aspirational. We're striving towards all of this, right? And then you will see that behavioral, this is a sample from the Eugene Congregation in Oregon, and this is their church's behavioral covenant, which states, "As a beloved community empowered by love, we covenant to embrace the next person who is always arriving, open to the change they will bring. We covenant to trust others in their identity and truth and work to be trustworthy. We covenant to speak our truth bravely and gently as we commune in love and peace. We covenant to make efforts to understand the views of others and make amends when intentions and impact collide. We covenant to expand our connections with the larger community with humility and empathy. And we covenant to remember that how we are with each other is the foundation upon which we build the beloved community." So that's one example, and we've looked at numerous different examples, and Bill's going to talk a little bit about that part today. And yeah, now it's Bill's turn.
So we've talked about aspirational covenant. What do we feel? What are we deeply committed to? And those are lovely things. That's what we're here for. But there's the practical matter of how do you live those beliefs in a world where you make mistakes, where sometimes you try to be thoughtful and you end up being thoughtless. You bump into people you didn't intend to bother at all. So most churches in the Unitarian community have put together written covenants as to how to behave with each other. And to me, it comes down to, how do you translate, we're committed to love. I don't think we're arguing about that, but how do you translate love into action? There's a quote that I love from Scott Peck, which I'm showing here, which is, love is as love does. Love is an act of will. It's something you do. It has to get beyond a feeling to change your life and to change others' lives. So what is it that we want to commit to as we act as a community? And as we get through our rough spots and disagreements, and they're guaranteed to happen again and again. So as we thought about this somewhat intimidating job, Kelly and Tina and I, we thought, how are we possibly going to figure this out? But the answer sort of fell in our laps, that if we're committed to building a covenant and getting down in writing how we want to behave one with the other, there is a great deal to draw on from other communities, from other Unitarian communities who've put together a covenant. And you can almost pick and choose, and I'm not saying that choosing is going to be trivial, because there's exactly how you want to word these commitments one to another are something that we want to get right. But we wandered, one evening meeting, the three of us wandered through the web looking at covenants from other churches, and there was so much to draw from. It was, okay, which do I want? Well, it's like the dynasty dinner at the Chinese restaurant. Do I want one from column A and one from column B? And you can see there were a lot of themes emerging as we analyzed what were in these covenants. Those are the churches we drew from. One thing to remind ourselves is we're talking about 100 or 200 words. We're not writing a massive document. We're just trying to get a few principles of commitment to each other down. And as you analyze what other communities said, these communities talked about a commitment to community. And rather than read them, I'll just remind myself as you look at them of how these communities spoke about their own commitment to community. They spoke to acting lovingly in several ways, being welcoming to all, welcoming to the people you know and have spent time with in this church for years, and the next person who's going to walk in the door, who's a stranger to start. Trust and be trusting. Bring trust to your relationships in the church. That's a theme that shows up. And kindness, forgiveness, confidentiality. I'm going to make mistakes, you're going to make mistakes. Let's be kind to each other as we do so. And each of these clauses here are just deconstructed. I've pulled a piece out of one and a piece out of another here to give you some examples. Speaking thoughtfully. Think about what you say, but do speak deeply and truly. You don't speaking directly means don't hide issues under the rug. Don't pretend that there's agreements that aren't there, and don't try to deal with agreements by talking through a third party. If I have something that needs to be cleared up with somebody in this church, I expect that it's my duty to deal with that directly. And conversely, if you have something you need to tell me, come to me and talk directly, because we don't get anywhere. And of course, we've seen this kind of behavior we're trying to avoid. We don't get anywhere by third-party diversion of concerns. If I'm upset with somebody, I'm going to go complain about them to a third party, because I can at least get it off my chest. And that's what we're committing not to do in this case. We want to be direct. And we want to listen carefully and strive to understand, what exactly is that person saying? We practice that in our Soul Matters circles, where we have the discipline of spending our time listening to somebody rather than preparing our next rejoinder. I just want to listen to you. I don't want to pretend I'm listening to you while my brain's spinning about what am I going to say back to her to get myself back on the table. So there's bits and pieces here, and we think we can make a long way towards the covenant by, in our next step, getting some of these ideas out on a table, printed on some big pieces of paper. We'll lay them out in the fellowship hall after a sermon in early March. For a couple weeks after that word, we'll put them up on the hallway outside Tina's office, and you can mark them up. What do you like? What don't you like? What could be said better? What do we want to commit to? Because, okay, there's some final ideas here about working together in community. Commitment to democratic process, democratic outcomes. When we decide on something as a community, it's decided. If we want to bring it up again through a democratic process and re-adjudicate it, that's fine. But we're all in together unless we decide to rework something we've decided on. Working to resolve conflict. However we do it, we need to recognize that conflicts will arise, and we want to work through them in a loving way. And then, and this is perhaps one of the iffier parts of what we might want to write into a covenant or not, what do we want to say about our commitment to stewardship? Is that a covenantal thing, or is it something to be dealt with in other forms? So a bunch of ideas. We'd like to hash them out. We'd like to get bits and pieces of covenant here on the walls in our minds as we talk through them to stitch something together, our 100 or 200 words that we can vote on in May at the Congregational meeting. And, you know, song lyrics always come to me. And as we were talking about this one, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young came to mind. You're just saying, you know, whatever we're doing, if we can't do it with love in our hearts, then, you know, why bother doing it at all? That's the way we want to act with each other, and that's the way we want to build this covenant. Okay, Kelly's going to finish up talking about how we're actually going to do this thing.
Yeah, and already Bill mentioned, here is our way forward. Let us develop our congregation's covenant together. Myself, Bill, and Reverend Tina serve on the board as a covenant planning team, and we're all open to questions, comments, and feedback at any point. Then, of course, as mentioned earlier, March 2nd, Tina will speak about why we need a behavioral covenant as a church community. Then after the service, we'll begin the creation of the covenant together in the fellowship hall with cake and snacks and coffee. And what are we asking of the congregation? Your thoughtfulness, your questioning, your intentional listening to each other. We ask for your ideas shared on March 2nd and throughout the month of March. We ask you to write your ideas on the display or email us, the team. Inputs will be posted after that March 2nd. They'll be posted in the hallway outside Tina's office until March 23rd. Then we'll take it down. The covenant planning team will take it down, assemble your ideas into a final draft covenant that will be included in your April annual meeting packet. The draft covenant will be voted on at the Congregational meeting on May 4th. Thanks for coming to the forum, and we'll take questions. Did you guys have anything else?
So I just wanted to say, too, that when congregations work on covenanting, the next step is to then, and we can talk about this as a community too, and on the board, is to create a right relations policy and a right relations team. And that, then those are the people that are the tenders of the covenant, right? And so those people would then be elected at our annual meeting as well. But creating that right relations policy of how do we deal with conflict, right? If covenant has been broken, What is the process, right, for forgiveness and repair and reconciliation? So that is the next step after when churches create covenant, is to then look into a right relations policy and a right relations team to be tenders. So that's also some knowledge for y'all. Questions? Yay, Susan.
Is this being recorded so we can?
Yes, it is being recorded, correct? We are recording? Yeah. So we can, send it to people.
So our questions can be, we can go over it and summarize what we've talked about.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's what I had.
No. Cool, yes. This will be available, and we'll send it out to the wider congregation in an announcements email so that folks can watch it.
Yeah, can we post the slides too?
Ooh, let's try to do that too.
So will there be a way for people to provide input other than having to be in the hallway outside your office?
Yes, email as well.
So we'll put the latest draft or whatever.
Yeah, once we get all of, so Bill's slides are essentially those groupings of categories of congregational covenants that he grouped together. We'll be putting those out on, like you said, on the tables on March 2nd, a big printed category of conflict resolution, one category, and some wording around that. And then what we're going to have folks do is either write some more of their thoughts of how they would express, let's say, conflict resolution and how we would want to covenant around that. They can write their own sentences. We're also going to have heart stickers for people to put next to things that have already been written, so that they can, we can see which ones people like more. And then, we can kind of make some photos of those or slides of those, and then send those out too after the March 2nd. I think that's a good idea. Thank you. Yeah, so it's not just in the hallway. People can access online too.
As you folks have been researching this, have you gotten any information about what happens within congregations that have adopted such a covenant? What were they sort of experiencing in this realm before they had a covenant, and how did the covenant change things?
My impression is if you look at a typical website from a UU congregation, their covenants, you don't find ones without covenants. We're kind of behind in this matter. So where they were beforehand, I have not come across that. The Eugene Church that you were in, they had a covenant of long-standing.
They had a long-standing covenant, and they were actually, so I got to be a part of the right relations policy making team when I was there, and so they were actually just creating that, but they did have their covenant long before they were creating the right relations policy. So yeah, I don't really have knowledge of prior to covenant or how churches functioned, but I will say that from UU perspective, and when I, as a minister, am looking at churches and if they have a covenant, that's a pretty big indicator that, hey, this church does have a covenant, and they hopefully are functioning in a healthy way, especially around conflict when it arises, right? And so for me, it's an indicator that, hey, yeah, we are working on these things that could come up in our congregation, and we have a process for that, right, of addressing some of those things. So to me, it's a sign of a healthy UU congregation and a thriving congregation. Sometimes UU churches have covenants and they don't always adhere to them. So there's that too. But yeah, I don't have much knowledge on churches prior to covenant and post creating it.
Well, I just want to say that, just the categories that you put in for a covenant and all the things that you pulled out, from other sources in those categories really stimulated my brain. So to me, what a wonderful way for a community to talk about itself and recognize itself as a self, a bigger self, instead of our little individual ideas. So I think the more people we get engaged, and I'm looking around and there's not a lot of people here. So what I'm wondering is, do you have plans to do this in a Sunday service, so where we're having lots of people come, so that people can be pulled into this, on each one of those categories even, and therefore both online people who are watching and then people here present can be part of it? Yeah. So is that a plan?
Yes. Yeah, so March 2nd is our kind of Covenant Sunday. And it's also New Member Recognition Sunday, so it's goes hand in hand that way. So yeah, we'll be doing a service around Covenant, and there might be some participatory things that we do in the service. And then a lot of the participation is going to be after the service, and we're going to have cake and food, and Felicia's making food, and we're going to have cake for our new members, so hopefully people will stay because of that. So yeah, we're hoping that March 2nd Sunday is going to be a good Sunday to explore this with each other and have a bigger crowd. Yeah.
I have a question. So what's the difference really in a covenant in this sense versus what we did many, many years ago for vision and mission statements?
You were part of that.
I think those were very brief, not very many words, and they were aspirational. To throw the doors wide open, we're a beacon of hope, and we want to be what we want to be. This is, I don't want to say practical, because bringing love into action into your own life is not just a practical, cross the dots, cross the T's, dot the I's activity. But I feel kind of vulnerable at this point that we don't have a covenant. If things have been going reasonably well, but if a real conflict arose, what would we turn to as to, here's what we've agreed to. Here's our starting point to work our way out of this jam. Because you could have one person say, I'm just being intellectually honest, and the other person says, oh, you're not being kind. And what do we draw on to say, okay, here's what we all agreed on, and how do we build from that to get, not to ignore this conflict, but to work through it?
I have a question and a comment. About how many words did you say we would be looking at?
Other congregations are 100 to 200.
Okay. And then just a response, kind of taking off on what you said. I mean, I've been here 21 years-ish. And while I don't feel like we've experienced much conflict recently, we have in the past, in my 20 years here. And one situation in particular I remember being really painful to address. And having a covenant I assume this includes both staff and the congregation. Some guidelines in how, just like you said, Bill, and how we want to interact with each other in a conflict.
A general thought I'm having is that in the intent to be kind to ourselves, that we would want this to be very much in the vein of we will try, As you said, we will make mistakes, we will fail sometimes. And so I can picture a lot of things that we will try to do that aren't necessarily the way we live our normal day-to-day lives out in the world, but we are saying we're a special community to each other, and we're going to try to do these at a higher level. And so in that sense, it's still going to be aspirational. It's not going to be you shall do this and you shall do that, and here's our rules and here's the enforcers of the rules. So it seems like it's going to be some interesting territory if we go down this path of what we're aspiring to do that's pretty high level, nuanced ways of interacting personally and in groups, and encouraging them but not enforcing them in some heavy way.
I just love what you're saying. We're going to try, and if that doesn't work, we're going to keep trying.
Yeah, Susan has a question. I will also say that this is something that we want to include for all of our members and new members in their signing of our membership book too, is that you're signing this covenant with our community as well, right? So that, right now we have, just sign the book. It's great. And that's good and all, but to me, it actually would feel more meaningful to be signing yes, I do covenant to these values in this community that I want to uphold, right? So, yeah. Elroy. Your microphone's not on.
Yes. I would continue with the idea that an aspirational view of the world is something that is always fundamental to the way we live. But even though I am happy to hear a lot of what I'm hearing, there's something about this approach that doesn't fit terribly well with the way I view the world, because I have this notion about how there is an inner life that I and everyone else lives. And there are things about the inner life that you lean on the church to help you with, but you don't make the claim that what the church says about itself is adequate to fulfill all the needs that you feel within, which you're looking for with all sorts of things that you try to do. So I just want to note that I'm not terribly closely tied to the terminology that comes out of this discussion. And I, in fact, have on my wall the principles of the church, and I will read them sometimes, and I tend to agree with them until I get to the bottom line. And on the bottom line, it acts as though I'm somehow supposed to take those things and treat them as though they are the fundamental commitment of my life, due to the terminology it uses, pledging. And the answer to that is, this is part of my life, but it's not the pledge of my life. The pledge of my life is something that, you've called it aspirational, that simply goes beyond this. And, there's a limit to the extent that I make a pledge to the church, because it's only part of my life.
Yeah, I definitely think that can be even the verbiage can be reflected in a covenant in that way, right? This is only one pledge, or not my whole life pledge, right? So, yeah, you can think about using some of those words that you just spoke in our covenant as well, right?
And when you were saying using those words, once we do compile what we want, before we do that, is there a couple of resources that we could look at that are Unitarian that would have these types of ideas in more depth?
There's lots. Yeah, I mean, we can definitely send out information after this forum, right, along with the forum, and print out our slides for folks to look at and take home. And there's a course that, we took online, the UU Institute. It costs like 10, 15 bucks. Yeah. So you can take that course, like if you want to go more in depth with it, yeah, for sure. We can send out those links.
The slides, the first couple slides.
Yeah, it's where we got a lot of this information for this forum.
It's the UU
too.
Institute. Oh, UU Institute, and is it Covenant 109? I forget. It's 109 something or other. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw a lot of inspiration there and why you should have a covenant. To get to the practicalities of, okay, how do you write this thing? The best thing we could do is just go from one church to another and look at their own covenants. And, the board has a covenant. We wrote a little covenant in the fall. We're happy with that. There's a UUA covenant, which is somewhere between behavioral and aspirational, I would say. There's examples.
It's UU Institute's Covenant Exploration 109.
Cool. Then there's even more, like, yeah.
There's a 2.0 something or other. And
Right. There's a whole institute about right relations policy work. There's, it continues. Membership, yeah, there's lots. So it's a good place to go if you want some more of that more in-depth learning, for sure.
Any other questions?
More to come.
Thank y'all. And
Thanks for
again,
joining.
you can email us with more questions and thoughts and comments. So thank you for coming. Yay.